The most powerful man in the city was on his knees. Not before a rival. Not before a judge. Before a boy in a wet hoodie. 200 guests sat frozen under crystal chandeliers as the child held up a crumpled photograph and looked straight at the man at the altar. "Are you our father?" The music had died mid-note. The priest had gone silent. The bride's hand had slowly slipped from the groom's arm. Salvatore D'Angelo, feared by senators, obeyed by killers, opened his mouth. And said nothing. The kitchen smelled of lemon bleach and a radiator that had been leaking for 3 winters. Amara stood at the counter in her diner uniform, her name tag crooked over a heart that had been running a marathon for 8 years. She opened the refrigerator, a carton of milk, half an onion. She sat at the scarred table and opened her notebook, columns of numbers, the rent line growing larger every month. She gave herself 60 seconds with her forehead against the cool wood. Then she reached into the back of the junk drawer. Beneath a stack of unpaid bills was a small folded piece of paper and a photograph of a man with eyes like midnight. Salvatore looked out from the glossy paper with a smile that was both a promise and a threat. She touched the corner of the photo, her thumb resting where his heart would be. Every dollar she saved was a brick in a wall she was building to keep her children safe. The wall was starting to crumble. 3 weeks before the wedding, Zubri stood in the cramped bathroom holding the stolen photograph next to his own face in the cracked mirror. He was only 8, but he carried his shoulders like a man who knew exactly how much a gallon of milk cost. He looked at the man in the photo, the sharp suit, the cold eyes, the way he held himself like he owned the air around him. Then he looked at his own reflection. Nia sat on the edge of the bathtub, her small toes curling against the cold linoleum. "Is that him, Zubri?" "It's him." He tucked the photo into his hoodie pocket. "Does Mama know you took it?" "Mama is afraid of him." He paused. "I saw her crying over the newspaper." He didn't tell her what he'd found under the kitchen rug, a bright announcement of Salvatore D'Angelo's upcoming marriage to a woman named Valentina. While they ate cereal with water because the milk had run out, their father was planning to feed 500 people on a marble floor. Zubri looked back at the mirror. He didn't see a boy anymore. He saw a son who was finished with being a secret. The school playground was a chaos of screaming children and rusted swings. Zubri and Nia sat on a concrete planter at the back, their voices low beneath the noise. "We have to go on Saturday," Zubri said. "But Mama will be at the diner." "That's why we go then." He pulled out a math worksheet, a route drawn on the back in pencil. "The cathedral is 6 miles if we take the back streets." Nia studied the jagged line that led from their gray world into the gold-leaf center of the city. "What if he doesn't want us?" Zubri folded the map and put it back in his pocket. "Then we'll know." He didn't tell her about the man in a dark suit he'd seen watching their building 2 nights ago. He only knew that if they didn't move now, they would be ghosts forever, trapped in the silence their mother had built to protect them, a silence that was slowly suffocating her. The kitchen light flickered twice and died. Amara had just finished a double shift. She reached for the faucet, and then the pain hit, a hot wire pulled through her ribs. The glass slipped. It shattered, but she didn't hear it. She slumped against the refrigerator, her breath coming in short, sawing gasps. "Mama?" Nia screamed from the bedroom. Amara tried to reach for her daughter. Her arm weighed 1,000 pounds. She slid down to the linoleum, her face a gray color that stopped Nia in the doorway. Zubri ran in and grabbed the phone, his fingers slick with sweat. She stopped breathing, he shouted into the receiver. He waited for the operator, staring at his mother, the woman who had worked herself to the edge of a cliff to keep them safe. He reached into his pocket and felt the edges of the photograph. The only way to help her was to burn down the life she had been hiding from. The city at night was a monster of iron and glass. Zubri held Nia's hand so tight his palm ached, leading her through streets that smelled of salt and exhaust. The cathedral spires rose above the skyline like a crown, visible from 6 blocks away. "I'm cold," Nia whispered. Her dress was soaked through. "Almost there." They moved through a parking lot where a security guard slept in a booth. Every step away from the hospital where their mother lay was a step toward a man who didn't know they existed. Zubri felt the note in his pocket, the one Amara had written to herself 8 years ago, the one that proved who they were. Walking into that cathedral was like walking into a cage with a lion. But their mother's heart was failing because she had no one to help her carry the weight. They reached the base of the stone steps as the first black limousines began to pull up. The cathedral was heavy with incense and 5,000 white lilies. Salvatore stood at the altar in a tuxedo that fit him like armor, Valentina beside him in a gown of silk and lace. The priest's voice rose toward the gold-leafed ceiling. In the third row, Marco kept one hand on his jacket, scanning the crowd of senators and power brokers who had come to witness the union of 2 families. Then the great oak doors groaned open. The squeak of wet rubber on marble cut through the priest's words. 2 children walked down the center aisle, their wet clothes dripping onto the white silk runner. "Who are they?" a woman whispered. Salvatore turned. The boy looked exactly like the man Salvatore saw in the mirror every morning. The world tilted. The gold and the flowers and the music turned to ash. The boy stopped 3 feet from the altar. He reached into his pocket and held up the crumpled photograph where every guest in the room could see it. "Are you our father?" The silence was so absolute you could hear the wax dripping from the candles. Salvatore looked at the children, then at his bride, then at the 5 families already leaning together in their pews, whispering. He had spent 8 years building a palace on a foundation of lies. It crumbled in the time it took a boy to ask a single question. Valentina didn't scream. She didn't throw her bouquet. She looked at the children's mud-stained shoes. She looked at the way the boy's jaw was set in a line of pure defiance. Then she looked at Salvatore, and she saw the man he truly was behind the mask, a man who had left a woman and 2 children to survive in the dark while he played king in the light. "I thought I was the only secret you were keeping," she said. Her voice was thin and sharp as wire. "Valentina, please. I can explain." She stepped back, her silk train rustling over the rose petals. "There is nothing to explain to me." Her eyes moved to Nia, half hidden behind her brother's arm. "You chose this life. You chose to hide them. I will not be the woman who helps you bury your own blood." She picked up her bouquet, her fingers tight around the stems, and walked down the aisle with her head high. She didn't look at Marco as she passed him, but the guard felt the shift in the room, the moral weight of her exit settling like a verdict. Guests began rising, silk and expensive suits blurring toward the doors. Salvatore didn't chase her. He stayed, and he knelt on the marble floor, and he reached for the children he had tried so hard to forget. The grand hotel lobby felt as cold as a tomb. Salvatore sat on a velvet sofa in the center of the room, his tuxedo jacket on the floor. Nia had finally stopped shaking, she was asleep with her head against his leg, her small floral dress wrinkled and stained with the day. Zubri sat 2 feet away in a matching chair, back straight, watching his father with a guarded look that belonged to a man 3 times his age. Marco stood by the elevators. Watching. His face was tight with a new kind of fear that had nothing to do with rivals. Salvatore looked at the mud streaks on the marble floor, the marks his children had made just walking in, and felt the true cost of every deal he had ever made. "What is your name?" he asked. His voice cracked. "Zubri." "And your sister?" "Nia." Salvatore reached out to touch the girl's hair, then stopped, his hand hovering. He had run an empire of fear and silk. He didn't even know the names of his own children. I'm going to take care of you, he whispered. Zuberi didn't smile. He leaned forward, hands white-knuckled on his knees. Our mother is at the hospital. The words hit Salvatore harder than any bullet. She stopped breathing, Zuberi added quietly. Salvatore was already on his feet, already looking for Marco to get the car, and then he saw Marco's face. The stillness in it. The calculation. And for the first time, a cold question formed at the back of Salvatore's mind that he wasn't ready to answer yet. The hospital garden was a small patch of green surrounded by brick walls, smelling of rain and antiseptic. Amara sat in a wheelchair in a thin paper gown, her feet bare on the cold footrests. A nurse named Elena adjusted the four on her bruised arm, then nodded toward the bright glass doors of the waiting room, where a man in a ruined white wedding shirt hadn't moved in 3 hours. You have visitors. Amara didn't look toward the glass. I want to see my children first. Zuberi appeared from the lobby, his brown hoodie zipped to his chin. He sat on the grass beside her wheelchair. I found him, Mama, he whispered, taking her hand. He came. He's here for us. Amara didn't cry. She pulled him close, her face iron, thinking about the day she had first seen the black cars in her old neighborhood and decided to run. She had known, even then, that secrets hunt you down. She had bought time, not safety. She looked over Zuberi's shoulder at Marco through the waiting room glass. He was at the coffee machine, his phone in his hand, sending a message to someone whose name she already knew, men who had been paid to keep her hidden years ago. Men who would now be punished for her being alive. Zuberi thought he had saved them. He had walked them into the center of a war. Go back to your sister, Amara said. She waited until his shadow vanished into the building before she let her shoulders shake. The rooftop recovery deck was a square of concrete high above the midnight city, the traffic below a river of red and white light. Amara sat wrapped in a navy hospital blanket, her hair tangled, her skin gray under the security lights. Salvatore walked through the steel door, his wedding shirt wrinkled and coffee-stained, no flowers, no lawyers, nothing but the silence of a man who had run out of comfortable lies. He sat across from her, his knees nearly touching hers. Why didn't you tell me, Amara? She looked past him at a blinking airplane in the distance. Because the man you were back then would have seen a family as a weakness to be buried. He opened his mouth. Then he closed it, because he knew she was right. Did someone tell you I wouldn't choose you? He leaned forward. Someone specific? Amara reached into the small drawer of the rolling nightstand. She pulled out a piece of paper, yellowed, folded soft from years of being touched in the dark, and pressed it into his palm. Salvatore unfolded it slowly. A single name. Written in Amara's careful handwriting from 8 years ago. Marco told me you had already signed the order to have us removed, she whispered. So your path to the throne would be clean. Through the glass door, Marco watched them. His hand rested on the hidden gun at his hip. The secret he had used to control the boss for a decade was burning. His only move now was to make sure Amara didn't live to see morning. The hospital parking lot hummed under orange street lamps. Amara sat on a stone bench near the entrance, her blanket around her legs, Nia tracing patterns on a nearby car window. A man in a gray suit approached with the walk of someone who had never had to ask for anything, the family lawyer, Mr. Rossi, briefcase in hand. He sat beside her and slid a thick blue folder across the bench. The smell of fresh ink cut through the damp night air. This is a settlement from Marco, he said. Enough for a house in another city, the best schools for the children. A life where you never look over your shoulder again. All you have to do is sign. Amara looked at the papers. She looked at the numbers, which were exactly the price of her silence for the last 8 years. She picked up the silver pen he offered. Then she set it back down, folded the blue folder in half, an ugly, permanent crease, and returned it. No. Rossi's practiced composure cracked. You are making a mistake you won't live to regret. Then Marco should have thought of that before he sent you. Rossi walked to his car. The moment he was gone, Amara pulled the small phone Salvatore had left with her from her blanket pocket and hit the speed dial. Salvatore answered on the first ring. She could hear an engine roaring beneath his voice. He sent a lawyer, she said. I know. His voice was colder and more precise than she had ever heard it. I'm in the sedan right behind Rossi's car. Marco is in my passenger seat. He thinks we're going to a meeting. Amara stared at the gate where Rossi's car had disappeared. Don't do anything until I get there, Salvatore said. But she could already hear the speedometer climbing. The private courtyard of the D'Angelo estate was cold stone and black fountain water. Salvatore stood at the stone table, a heavy dark sweater replacing the wedding shirt, his hands flat on the marble. Marco walked in, still adjusting his cufflinks, wearing the practiced calm of a man who had survived 20 years of this family's business. He expected noise. Instead he found silence, and the yellow note sliding across the stone toward him under the garden lantern. Explain this, Marco. Marco looked at Amara's handwriting. For the first time in 20 years, his eyes couldn't find a direction to look. The lie was too old and too well made to survive being held in the light. I was protecting the family, boss. From 2 children and a woman working a diner shift? Marco said nothing. You told her I'd signed an order. You used my name to terrorize a mother into hiding her children. Salvatore's voice didn't rise. It got quieter, which was worse. You used me to steal 8 years. 2 of the younger guards stepped forward and stripped the radio from Marco's belt. Salvatore watched it happen without satisfaction. No title. No room. No name, Salvatore said. Get out of my city. Marco walked through the narrow service corridor toward the street, his footsteps slowing as he saw who was waiting in the shadows. Amara, no longer in a hospital blanket, but a borrowed coat, her eyes holding a fire that hadn't gone out in 8 years. He stopped. He sneered, even now. You told me he signed the paper, she said. Her voice was small. The words were not. Marco leaned in close. His voice dropped to a whisper. He didn't have to sign it for it to be true. He walked away, and Amara stood alone in the dark corridor, understanding for the first time that even with Marco gone, the world she was walking back into was not safe, because Salvatore had built it. Weeks passed. Salvatore showed up. He was there at the school gate in jeans and a windbreaker, nothing like the man who had knelt on marble in a tuxedo. He didn't reach for the children when they came out. He just opened the car door and waited for them to decide. Later, at a park cafe, he sat with a math workbook open between them. His hand trembled slightly as he tried to explain long division to Nia. That's not how the teacher does it, Mr. D'Angelo, she said, pointing her pencil at his mistake. He looked at the wrong numbers and almost laughed. He moved millions of dollars. He couldn't help a second grader with her homework. Show me how the teacher does it, he said. And she did. It was the first conversation he hadn't been afraid of in 20 years. A few days later they sat in Amara's apartment, the small kitchen, the mismatched plates, the smell of garlic and things unsaid. Salvatore watched Amara move through the kitchen with a grace he had forgotten, and he thought he was making progress. What he couldn't see, the way her hand shook each time she went near the drawer where the secret note used to live. The pasta is good, Amara, he said, reaching for neutral ground. Zuberi looked at him from across the table, his dark eyes steady. My mother makes everything good because she learned to do it alone, Mr. D'Angelo. Salvatore put his fork down. He didn't have an answer. He was starting to understand that showing up was not the same as making it right. The harbor was bright and noisy, seagulls, cranes, a tourist ferry blowing its horn. Salvatore walked the wooden pier beside Zubri, who wore a yellow raincoat that made him look like a small beacon against the gray dock. Salvatore had come to the school gate that morning for no reason except the feeling in his chest that told him he was running out of time. They walked. They didn't say much. It was, Salvatore thought, the most honest hour he'd spent in years. He reached into his jacket and showed Zubri his old watch, the heavy gold one. He set it on a dock piling. "I don't need it anymore," he said simply. Zubri studied the watch. He didn't pick it up. "You could give it to the fisherman over there. His net has been broken since Thursday." Salvatore looked at the old man sitting on a crate mending nylon rope, and for a moment he felt the reflex rise, the old instinct to treat everyone around him as scenery. He held it down. He walked over. He handed the man the watch. "For your trouble," he said, and felt absurd, but he said it. The fisherman turned the watch over in his weathered hands with a look of bewildered dignity. "I just need thread," the man said, and pointed to a hardware store across the dock road. Salvatore bought him thread. When he came back, Zubri was watching him from the pier railing with an expression that wasn't quite approval, but wasn't its opposite either. They walked back toward the black car in silence. Then Zubri stopped. "Okay," he said. "Okay, what?" "You can be father." He kept his eyes on the horizon. "If you want." Salvatore gave a slow nod that felt like signing a contract more sacred than any deal he'd ever made. What he couldn't see, Marco, standing in the shadow of a warehouse 30 yards behind them. Watching. Holding a heavy black envelope. Still counting. The bistro patio was warm with afternoon light, the smell of coffee and fresh bread in the air. The twins were at school. For this hour, there were no bodyguards, no sirens. Just Amara in a cream blouse and Salvatore in a dark sweater, 2 cups of coffee between them, the distance between them smaller than it had been but still real. Salvatore reached into his jacket and placed the yellowed note on the table. "You should have this back," he said. "It belongs to you. It was never his to use, and I should have been man enough to see it myself." Amara looked at her own handwriting. The secret that had kept her in poverty was now just a piece of paper. She folded it once, with a finality that felt like the closing of a very long chapter, and tucked it into her bag. Salvatore talked about the children's upcoming soccer game with the ease of a man practicing at being ordinary. He was trying. She could see that. She also saw what he couldn't, a black car parked across the street that hadn't moved since they sat down. "We're going to be okay, aren't we?" he said, looking out at the peaceful street. Amara looked at him for a long moment. "I already told the children we're moving to a place you can never find." The words landed soft and final, like a door being closed gently rather than slammed, but closed all the same. The sun was an orange coin sinking into a quiet harbor town, far from the city's concrete heart. Salvatore stood on damp sand in a loose linen shirt, his feet bare, the heavy gold watch replaced by a braided leather band. He had come here because there was nothing left to run. A few yards away, a boy, the son of a local fisherman, was struggling with a rusted trap in the shallows. He tripped. The trap pinned his hand against a rock. The tide hissed around his ankles. Salvatore dropped to his knees in the wet sand without thinking. He braced his shoulders and lifted the iron trap until the boy could pull free. He checked the marks on the child's hand with a careful, clumsy touch, the touch of a man who was new to gentleness, still learning its weight. The boy ran back to a small wooden cottage at the edge of the beach. From the tall grass nearby, Marco watched. He had followed them here in one last act of calculation, waiting for the old Salvatore to reappear. The old Salvatore did not. Salvatore stood up, brushed the wet sand from his knees, and looked at the cottage. In the doorway, a woman stood watching him, the last of the sunlight catching her face. Not Amara. A stranger. But the look on her face, cautious, measuring, not yet sure, was one he recognized. He had put that look on Amara's face, and on his children's faces, and on the faces of every person who had ever needed to assess whether he was a threat. He raised a hand. A small gesture. The woman gave a short nod and went back inside. Marco stepped out of the grass. There was nothing left to offer and nowhere left to go. He looked at the man on the beach and saw that the lever he had used for 20 years, the fear that Salvatore would always choose power over people, was broken. He turned and walked away along the shoreline until the darkness took him. Salvatore stood in the wet sand as the last light left the sky. He had lost the throne. He had lost the woman. He might yet lose the children. But he had set down something heavier than all of it. He breathed. If this story moved you, share it with one person who needs it today. Thank you for being here for Arden Tells Tales.